adopting the eighth principle as one of our proud LGBTQ. Welcome to First Parish in Needham, a Unitarian Universalist congregation founded in 1711 along with the town of Needham. We are a proud LGBTQ welcoming congregation, climate justice seeking green sanctuary, and a level 2 sanctuary supporting congregation for immigration justice. Whoever you are, whatever your background, and wherever you're watching from, you are welcome here. My name is Vicki McCready's. My pronouns are she, her. My husband Klaus and I joined First Parish in 2015, and since then I have been involved in a number of inspirational programs at First Parish. This morning, in recognition of our service today, commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Black Wall Street Massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was the worst act of racial violence in our country's history, and yet one that has largely been covered up and left out of the history books. I would like to spotlight the Racial Justice Task Force, which is chaired by Marianne McGowan, and to express gratitude to Reverend Katie and our ministerial intern, Jenna Crawford, who have been instrumental in supporting and encouraging us as we seek to build awareness, to educate ourselves and others, and to take actions to dismantle institutionalized white privilege and to contribute to healing the harm created by our legacy of racism. We hope these racial and social justice goals will be supported by a congregational vote, hopefully this fall, in favor of First Parish adopting the eighth principle as one of our community's covenantal agreements. As you know, what's happening right now at the congregation is very different than usual because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Although our building is closed, our faith community is open. We hope all of you will plug into our Zoom gathering opportunities throughout the week, including Zoom social hour after every Sunday service. You can learn more about all that's happening at First Parish by going on our website, uuneedham.org, or by following us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To get the Zoom links, please sign up for our weekly email newsletter by going to our website and clicking Get Involved Newsletter, or by sending your request to office@uuneedham.org. Our sincere hope is that these online services and connection opportunities will help us keep the physical distance required during this pandemic without losing much of the spiritual, emotional, and social closeness that we treasure in our faith community. If you're watching this service as it live streams, please take a moment right now to say hello and introduce yourself in the YouTube or Zoom chat box. Welcome again to everyone, and good morning. Chat box. Welcome again to everyone, and good morning.
As we light our chalice, symbol of our UU faith, we read words from Euro-American UU minister Reverend Barbara Pescan to honor both Memorial Day and the Black Wall Street Massacre. Spirit of life, whom we have called by many names in thanksgiving and in anguish. Let strong trees grow above graves far from home, breathe through the arms of their branches. The earth will swallow your tears while the dead sing, no more, never again, remember me. For the wounded ones and those who received them back, let there be someone ready when the memories come, when the scars pull and the buried metal moves, and forgiveness for those of us who were not there, for our ignorance. And in us, let new leaves of protest grow on our stumps. Give us courage to answer the cry of humanity's pain, and with our bare hands, out of full hearts, with all our intelligence, let us create the peace. Hymn number 1006, In My Quiet Sorrow, was written by Euro-American composer and music director of the UU Church in Middleborough, Jeannie Gagne, written in order to give voice to those things which are not expressed, kept within the silence of our hearts. Please join us in singing from home hymn number 1006, In My Quiet Sorrow.
deep inside I pray I'm strong. Blessed be.
In the Unitarian Universalist tradition, the covenant is a set of promises the membership of a congregation strives to honor with one another and out in the world. Though we cannot gather in person during this time, we strive to live these promises every day. Please say along with me from home the words of our parish covenant as shown on your screen. We gather as a loving community to encourage and comfort one another. We gather as a diverse community to support each other in our search for spiritual truth. We gather as a service community to live our beliefs through action and care for our world.
Good morning, friends. Today, Thoughtful Turtle introduces us to a very special emotional resiliency plush pal who can help us when we're handling really rough times and exploring really important thoughts. Here we have Breathing Bunny with Respectful Rabbit with Helpful Hair. Together, they're going to help us as we explore excerpts from Not My Idea, a book about whiteness, written and illustrated by Anastasia Higginbotham. When grown-ups try to hide scary things from kids, oh no, not again. What, Mom? What not again? It's usually because they're scared too. You don't need to worry about this. You're safe. Understand? No. I wonder if you can remember a time when parents, loved ones, and or even ourselves were too scared to talk, hiding things from others and ourselves. Breathing Bunny reminds us to take deep, healing breaths so that we can use our self-care and coping skills to do what we need to do so we can be brave enough to follow our values. Our family is kind to everyone. We don't see color. Deep down, we all know color matters. Skin color makes a difference in how the world sees you and in how you see the world. It makes a difference in how much trouble seems to find you or let you be. In stores, in cars, on sidewalks, at school, your skin color affects the most ordinary daily experiences, including which neighborhoods welcome you. When I was young, I didn't realize that our skin color affects the most ordinary daily experiences, and I'm still learning more about this. Thoughtful Turtle reminds us that there are many different truths in one shared experience. You may get the message that racism is happening only to Black and brown people. Racism is a white person's problem, and we are all caught up in it, mostly by refusing to look at it. You can face this. Racial justice, we must step up. Understanding the truth takes courage, especially a painful truth about your own people, your own family. Even people you love may behave in ways that show they think they are the good ones. Racism was not your idea. You don't need to defend it. You can bring your curiosity to learn about it and see that it's true. In the United States of America, white people have committed outrageous crimes against Black people for 400 years. All along, every step of the way, people who love justice and love each other have been fighting back. Many white people did things they never should have done, denied opportunity, denied housing, denied voting rights. Many other white people failed to see the problem with this. These choices put wealth and power into white hands, homes, and neighborhoods. Some white people joined the leaders of Black liberation. Racism is still happening. It keeps changing and keeps being the same. And yet, just being here, alive in this moment, you have a chance to care about this, to connect. Go with your instincts on this one. Racial justice is possible. But only if we're honest with each other and ourselves. Your history is not all written yet. What do you want it to say? Respectful Rabbit reminds us that understanding the truth takes courage, especially when we need to speak up about the truths that we are noticing. And Helpful Hair reminds us that even though this racist system is big and overwhelming, we can help. Just by using our Unitarian Universalist thinking minds as we keep asking questions and learning more, our loving hearts as we speak up about justice, and our helping hands to help in any way we can. Peace and love, my friends, as we do this vital work. Peace and love, my friends, as we do this vital work.
It is now time to share with one another our joys and concerns from the past week. These joys and concerns were submitted to me at internminister@uuneedham.org by the Thursday before the service at midnight. If you did not submit a candle but would like to share with the community this morning, you're invited to enter your message into the chat box on either Zoom or YouTube. As our service is live streamed to YouTube, we cannot guarantee that your joys, concerns, sorrows, and milestones will stay within the First Parish community, but you are always welcome to reach out to Reverend Katie, myself, or the Pastoral Care Associate of the Week, who this week is Amy Chikala, for pastoral care or to share more privately. If you're missing hearing each other's voices during this beloved ritual, may this also serve as a reminder to reach out to one another after the service. May this beloved community be sustained by your creativity and care for one another during this time. Our first candle this morning is a candle of concern from Claire Galkowski. In the past 4 weeks, severe back pain has disabled my 96-year-old stepmom, Millie, sending her to the hospital and rehab and exacerbating her dementia. She is realizing in her lucid moments that there is no good solution to the pain of a crumbling body and the confusion of a misfiring brain. I am inadequately trying to comfort and support her as she prepares to return to her assisted living community. Please hold Millie in your thoughts. Our next candle this morning is a candle of sorrow from the First Parish staff for the victims, victims' families, and community of San Jose after the Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority rail yard shooting this past Wednesday. Let us take a moment to name and remember those who we lost in the shooting. Abdul Wahab Alagmandan, 63, Adrian Bayeza, 29, Alex Ward Fritch, 49, Jose de Jesus Hernandez III, 35, Lars Kepler Lane, 63, Paul Dela Cruz Mejia, 42, Timothy Michael Romo, 49, Michael Joseph Rudo Metkin, 40, Tuptadeep Singh, 36, and San Jose gunman Samuel Cassidy, 57. We come together in our grief over this tragedy. In this space, we are reminded of our 6th UU principle, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and we shore up our courage as our grief turns to outrage and advocacy. May we work toward advocating for safe and responsible gun ownership legislation, as we also work to address related issues like access to mental health care. And our last candle this morning is also a candle from the staff, but a candle of joy. Euro-American climate activist Bill McKibben of The New Yorker writes, "In what may be the most cataclysmic day so far for the traditional fossil fuel industry, a remarkable set of shareholder votes and court rulings have scrambled the future of 3 of the world's largest oil companies. On Wednesday, a court in the Netherlands ordered Royal Dutch Shell to dramatically cut its emissions over the next decade, a mandate it can likely meet by only dramatically changing its business model. A few hours later, 61% of shareholders at Chevron voted over management objections to demand that the company cut so-called Scope 3 emissions, which includes emissions caused by its customers burning its products. The support for the cuts shows growing investor frustration with companies which they believe are not doing enough to tackle climate change. The most powerful proof of such frustration came shortly after, as ExxonMobil officials announced that shareholders had elected 2 dissident candidates to the company's board, both of whom pledged to push for climate action. For all the joys and all the sorrows that we still hold in our hearts this morning, and in acknowledging the prayers of our neighbors near and far, we light one final candle. May the peace in this sanctuary be felt too in each of your homes, as we remember that even though apart, we are still deeply connected. Amen.
Please join us now in the spirit of prayer and meditation. Spirit of life and love, God of many names, this is our prayer of lament for the lives, property, livelihoods that were destroyed on May 31st, 1921 in Greenwood, Tulsa. For the generational wealth all across Greenwood that came to a halt in a matter of 24 hours and was never properly returned or restored. For the trauma that never possibly went away in the lives of the survivors of the massacre and then was passed on to their children and their children's children and their children's children's children. For the doubling down on that trauma when stories about the massacre were silenced, a silence that stalled any possible repentance, apology, reparation, or healing.
This is our prayer of reckoning.
Reckoning with the full extent of the horror and terror the white mobs brought upon Greenwood nearly 100 years ago today.
Reckoning with the various forms of racism at play in the aftermath to silence that distort and deny justice to the survivors and their families.
For those of us racialized into whiteness, reckoning with our complicity in racial violence.
This is also our prayer of recommitment to what our Unitarian Universalism asks of us.
Our Unitarian social gospelers, like Francis Greenwood Peabody, reminded us that instead of worrying about a heavenly afterlife, we should be concerned about the heavens and hells that exist in our present society and work not to save souls, but to save bodies and lives in the here and now.
Instead of saying the right prayers and following the proper creed to make it into a heavenly afterlife, we should focus on reparations for past wrongs that lead to hell in the here and now.
Modern UU theologians of color, like Reverend Sophia Betancourt, remind us what it means to be the inheritors of universal salvation. It is our very universalism that is at stake when we turn away from the impact that our institutions have on the same communities and groups that society encourages us to dehumanize and make small.
It is our very universalism that is at stake. Our Unitarian Universalism asks us to
be a part of uncovering buried stories and buried truths, like the history in Greenwood, when we talk of the free and responsible search for truth and meaning.
Asks us to be outraged and stirred to action when we remember the inherent worth and dignity of all people.
And asks us to think seriously about the moral case to reparations when we recall the interdependence of all existence of which we are a part.
May it be so, and amen.
Now, please join us in singing our meditative hymn this morning, There is More Love Somewhere. The lyrics and music will appear on your screens.
There is more love
This congregation has been supported by the volunteered time and treasure of its members and friends since its founding in 1711. This is the time in our service when we, the modern stewards of this church, offer what we can to build and sustain the congregation and the world that we envision. Our plate collection today will be given to the Tulsa Metropolitan Ministries Race Massacre Reparations Fund. The fund was instituted in the early 2000s in huge part by the leadership of the Unitarian Universalist congregations in Tulsa, among other faith communities, for victims and descendants of the Black Wall Street Massacre. Right off after the offertory music, we'll hear a testimony from 107-year-old race massacre survivor Viola Fletcher about the lack of accountability and justice in the wake of the tragedy in Greenwood. Property damage was estimated at $1.6 million, which in today's dollars would amount to more than $16 million. And that is to say nothing of the value of the lives lost. This fund was created to offer direct payments to survivors of the massacre. To donate to today's offering, you can use one of three different methods. You can use our Text to Give program through the number 73256 with the exact wording of UU Needham space plate or Pledge 21 space $sign and the amount that you want to give. You can mail a check to First Parish at 23 Dedham Avenue, or you can make a donation through our website, uuneedham.org, and select Donate Now under the Giving box. Whichever way, remember to specify whether your donation is meant for the plate collection or for your annual pledge. Thank you for everything you are able to give to help support and sustain this congregation and the vital work of our community partners. Please take these next few moments to give what you can and know that it will be gratefully received.
My name is Viola Ford Fletcher. I'm the daughter of Lucinda Ellis and John Wesley Ford of Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm the sister of Hughes Van Ellis, who is also here today. I'm a survivor of the Tulsa Race Massacre. 2 weeks ago, I celebrated my 107th birthday. Today, I'm visiting Washington, D.C. for the first time in my life. I'm here seeking justice, and I'm asking my country to acknowledge what happened in Tulsa in 1921. The night of the massacre, I was awakened by my family. My parents and 5 siblings were there. I was told we had to leave, and that was it. I will never forget the violence of the white mob when we left our home. I still see black men being shot, black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still see black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams. I have lived through the massacre every day. Our country may forget this history, but I cannot. I will not, and other survivors do not, and our descendants do not. When my family was forced to leave Tulsa, I lost my chance of an education. I never finished school past the 4th grade. I have never made much money in my country. State and city took a lot from me. Despite this, I spent time supporting the war effort in the shipyards of California, but most of my life I was a domestic worker serving white families. I never made much money, but to this day I can barely afford my everyday needs. All the while the city of this Tulsa have unjustly used the names and stories of victims like me to enrich myself and its white allies through the 30s million raised by the Tulsa Centennial Commissioner while I was continued to live in poverty. I am a 107-year-old and have never seen justice. I pray that one day I will. I have been blessed with a long life and have seen the best and the worst of this country. I think about the terror, horror inflicted upon black people in this country every day. This subcontinued committee has the power to lead us down a better path. I'm asking that my country acknowledge what has been happened to me, the traumas and the pain, the loss, and I ask survivors and descendants to be given the chance to seek justice, open the door. All of you know how easy it is to deny that a violent mob threatened your lives and took your property. For 70 years, the city of Tulsa and its stream of commerce told us that the massacre didn't happen, like we didn't see it with our own eyes. You have me here right now. You see Mother Randall, you see my brother Hughes Van Ellis. We live this history and we can't ignore it. It's our lives with us. Oh my goodness. We lost everything that day, our homes, our churches, our newspapers, our theaters, our lives. Greenwood represented all the best of what was possible for black people in America and for all the people.
Let me start with a brief disclaimer. The sermon and service today are about the Black Wall Street Massacre in Tulsa in 1921. We use the word massacre because the events were so brutal that to call it anything else would be an act of deception. But please do what you need to do to take care of yourself this morning, particularly if you are a person of color. If you're watching on Zoom, feel free to turn your camera off, pause the video, or do whatever else you might need to do to take care. On May 30th, 1921, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Black 19-year-old Dick Rowland boarded an elevator operated by white 17-year-old Sarah Page. Not soon after, a nearby store clerk heard a scream. Dick had lost his footing and touched Sarah's arm, taking her by surprise, but that was all. But to the store clerk, Dick had tried to attack Sarah, and so he immediately called the police. Rumors begot more and more sensationalized rumors, playing off stereotypes of Black men at the time. And soon enough, the story was that Dick had attempted to rape Sarah. Dick was arrested and brought to the courthouse, and the next night, a mob of white men with a plan to lynch Dick Rowland descended on the jail. But they were met by 30 armed Black men who had anticipated the mob and were there to protect Dick by putting pressure on the sheriff and the local deputies. What erupted from there over the next 24 hours was the worst act of racial terror this country has ever seen. Once known as the Tulsa Race Riots and now often referred to as the Tulsa Race Massacre or the Black Wall Street Massacre. Somewhere between 30 and 40 blocks of Black homes and businesses were burned to the ground. It's estimated that hundreds of people of color were killed and 800 more injured. In the rare New York Times article that spoke with transparency about what transpired in Tulsa, journalists quoted eyewitnesses who claimed 25,000 whites armed to the teeth were raging the city in utter and ruthless defiance of every concept of law and righteousness. Motor cars bristling with guns swept through your city, their occupants firing at will. We also just heard from massacre survivor Viola Fletcher what it was like to be in Greenwood as white rage rained down on the city. I still see Black men being shot, she testified, Black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still see Black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams. One episode of the new HBO series Watchmen attempts to portray what it would have been like to be in Greenwood on May 31st, 1921. And spoiler alert, it was much too brutal to play a scene of that in church. And before we move on, I have one important question for you. When did you first learn about the Black Wall Street Massacre? Did you learn about it in your U.S. history classes in high school? I certainly didn't, and it wasn't that long ago that I took U.S. history. Was it part of that national historical memory, as best as you can remember it, of American tragedies and disasters? The Trail of Tears, Columbine, September 11th, Hurricane Katrina? No, right? For the large part of the 100 years since the massacre, what conspired in Tulsa was largely covered up. An ABC documentary on the subject explained that the newspapers at the time were owned by local white families and the government run by white politicians. The historic archives also have missing parts, editorials torn out on purpose. For instance, one editorial titled, "To Lynch Negro Tonight." And when news about the events was able to break the thick veil of silence, they were presented in entirely misleading ways. For instance, one national headline read, 85 whites and Negroes die in Tulsa riots as 3,000 armed men battle in the streets. 30 blocks burned, military rule in city. Even that identifier, Tulsa Race Riots, is misleading, generating an entirely different affect than when the word massacre is rightly used. It's not hard to see how what happened in Tulsa 100 years ago was racism at its very ugliest. But what happened in the 100-year aftermath of Tulsa, including this culture of silence, demonstrates some of the more insidious forms that racism takes. And it's just as important to see those as they are and condemn them as we condemn the violence itself. Let's back up for a minute and work through some definitions. First, race. Race itself is a social construct, but one with great social force. Denying that race has force in our society, many say, because it is socially constructed, is like telling somebody that doesn't have much money that money doesn't really exist in nature. Robin DiAngelo, scholar of the historical construction of whiteness in North America, explains that embedded within the category of race is an assessment of relative value. She goes on to define prejudice as quite literally a prejudgment, an unsubstantiated judgment based on inherited value. Prejudgments are actually a pretty normal thing to do. We're always prejudging things. But it becomes harmful when action is taken based on that prejudgment, which then gets called discrimination. With all these building block definitions in mind, DiAngelo then defines racism as what happens when racial prejudice is enforced by institutional forms of power, which is to say the way structures are set up across society that govern the way that we live. And that includes economic power, legal power, the power to create knowledge, social power, and so on. And the way that racism operates here in North America is in the particular form of white supremacy. White supremacy is the social structure. In other contexts around the world, racism might take the form of a different social structure. It is likely, though, that regions with similar foundational and historical beginnings, so marred by colonialism, so the Americas, Africa, and parts of Asia, the social structure shares some similarities with our own. So one more time, racism is what happens when racial prejudice is enforced by institutional forms of power, and that includes economic power, legal power, the power to create knowledge, social power, and so on. Can you begin to see how all of these forms of power are operating in the 100-year aftermath in Tulsa? First, economic power. In many ways, the entire Tulsa story was about economic power. Black writer Naja Amatullah Hilton, one of the authors of the children's book Opal's Greenwood Oasis, talks about how Tulsa was just as much a story about Black excellence as it was about Black pain. Opal's Greenwood Oasis portrays life in the Greenwood neighborhood just days before the massacre. Greenwood at the time was one of the most prosperous Black communities in the country, hence why Black civil rights leader Booker T. Washington named it Black Wall Street in the first place. You can begin to get the sense that the white mob's anger was not about Dick Rowland at all, but fueled by an internalized racial superiority, fueled by an outrage that whiteness was supposed to afford some economic benefits that were becoming hard to distinguish in Tulsa. And then, of course, the 24 hours of murderous destruction of life and property. The property damage alone from the massacre estimated at $1.6 million, which in today's dollars would be at least 10 times that. Generational wealth gone in an instant. And if we take a step back to think about how something like insurance is supposed to work when you lose all your belongings in a fire or your car to a car accident. You pay a little bit every month to ensure that when disasters happen, you don't lose everything in an instant. You're insuring yourself essentially against the vagaries of life. And it's usually not the case that such disasters are perpetrated with malice by other people, and even still, you're insured. But in Greenwood, the survivors and the descendants were never compensated for the extraordinary damages and losses of that day. Racism happens when racial prejudice is enforced by economic power. And then there's legal power. For our reading this morning, we saw Viola Fletcher's testimony to Congress. A few other survivors testified with her on May 18th, including her own brother, Hughes Van Ellis. Hughes explained in his testimony, "You might be taught that when something is stolen from you, you can go to the courts to be made whole. You can go to the courts to seek justice. But this was not the case for us. The courts in Oklahoma would not hear us. The federal courts said that we were too late. We were made to feel that our struggles were unworthy of justice, that we were less valued than whites, that we were not fully Americans." End quote. Yes, the courts too have been yoked to white supremacy in the same way that institutions of law enforcement have been. Latinx legal scholar Ian Haney Lopez in White by Law, The Legal Construction of Race, explains that the basic law of citizenship by birth did not include all racial minorities until 1940. And naturalized citizenship was conditioned on race until 1952. What's more, you might think about who the supposed jury of your peers are comprised of, what those juries look like. Racism happens when racial prejudice is enforced by legal power. And finally, there's the power to create knowledge. Colloquially, we often say history is written by the victors. This goes back to the fact that the Black Wall Street Massacre was left out of the history books, and where included, the facts were distorted. It wasn't a massacre, it was a race riot. The power to create knowledge and write the narrative is a dimension of racism that is intimately connected to economic power and legal power. Because if juries, judges, and elected representatives were not taught just how bad it was in Tulsa, it becomes easier to wave off Viola and Hughes. It becomes easier to deny them the justice that they deserve, a justice that would likely take the form of financial restitution. And so the rationales in the courts don't look quite so atrocious because they are supported by faulty logic and distorted history. But at least they are consistent. Racism happens when racial prejudice is enforced by systems of knowledge. What Tulsa depicts so clearly, so unmistakably, is what systemic racism looks like in practice. It is not something that a few organizations or individuals choose to practice. It is how our economic, legal, educational, political, and social systems operate and have always operated. And at the center of those institutions was an encounter of great violence, great trauma, great loss. That is the dialectic always at play, one that Black journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates talks often about. Every social structure reinforces it, and yet the consequences are not bureaucratic. They're physical and bodily. So let us close by thinking back to the prayer this morning, how our Unitarian social gospelers reminded us that instead of worrying about a heavenly afterlife, we should be concerned about the heavens and hells that exist in our present societies. Instead of following the right creed to make it into heaven, we should focus on reparations for past wrongs that lead to hell in the here and now. And let us close with the knowledge that Tulsa was not the only Tulsa. Reverend Katie and I stumbled upon a webpage maintained by the Zinn Education Project that lists all the massacres in U.S. history against Indigenous Americans, immigrants, and people of color, many also intentionally misbranded as race riots. For all the survivors and descendants of survivors in Tulsa, there are similar stories from the Los Angeles Chinatown Massacre, the massacre of a Lakota encampment at Wounded Knee, the Red Summer in Chicago, and countless others. Some lesser known, others that we thankfully now teach in school. And let us close remembering, as we heard in the Time for All Ages this morning, that understanding the truth takes courage. So let us be courageous. Let us heed Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s call to creative maladjustment, wherein we refuse to normalize inequality and instead continuously work to expose injustice. Let us live out our first and second and sixth and seventh UU principles by dismantling racism in ourselves and in our institutions. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen. Please remember that you are welcome to join into our Zoom social hour just after this service has ended. Keep a careful eye out for emails and social media posts from First Parish so that you can keep up with opportunities for connection for all ages throughout the week, during these times of physical isolation. You can sign up for our weekly email by clicking on Subscribe to Newsletter on our website, uuneedham.org. Please remember, if you fall ill or need any pastoral support, to reach out to me, Reverend Katie Scudera, and our amazing pastoral care and caring crew teams via phone or email. We also encourage all of you strongly to check in with your friends at First Parish and double-check your own contact information in our online Realm directory if you have not done so recently. Please email our office administrator, Susanna Whitman, if you have any questions about using our online directory. Right after this service, in Zoom social hour, Marianne McGowan will be holding space in a breakout room for you to petition your representatives to support Viola's request for federal, not just local Tulsa, but federal support for a reparations plan. You're invited to also come to the next meeting of the Racial Justice Task Force to learn more about our local Needham history and how to support reparations efforts in our own backyard. You can be in touch with Marianne for more information about the task force. And one more thing, don't forget to send me your questions for the panel discussion about integrating our UU values in reopening in our church and personal lives. You can email them to me at internminister@uuneedham.org by next Sunday, June 6th. We always extinguish our chalice with words promising to carry its flame in our hearts until we are together again, no matter how long it is until we are together again. As we extinguish our chalice today, please join me from home in saying those words written by Unitarian Universalist minister Reverend Elizabeth Selly Jones. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Hymn number 348, Guide My Feet, is an African-American spiritual included in early 1900s folk song collections by musician and scholar Willis Lawrence James. Please join us in singing from home hymn number 348, Guide My Feet.
While I run this race,
As we close our worship this morning, take these words from Black UU minister Reverend Kimberly Quinn Johnson with you as a benediction. Hush, somebody's calling your name. Can you hear it? Calling you to a past not quite forgotten, calling us to a future not fully imagined. Hush, hush, somebody's calling our name. What shall we do? Our service begins when the service ends. Go in peace.